Hi guys, and in today's video I'm talking primes versus zooms. What are the pros and the cons of both? I'm going to start off with the pros. So that is obviously a 35mm f2 prime lens. The pros for me are that you can get a faster aperture, f1.2 for 56mm for instance, which is something like that there. .4 for something like the 23mm, the original version, and f2 for the newer range of the prime lenses that Fuji do. Also, the pros are the zooms versus the primes. Primes tend to be a little bit sharper. Also, when you compare them, and this is both a pro and a con, and I'll get into the con in a moment, the primes are obviously a lot smaller than the zooms. The kit can be lighter, however, it can also be a con, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Primes are also cheaper. So a decent prime lens, even something like the 23mm 1.4, I mean they're all decent lenses, don't get me wrong, but what I mean is in terms of a really fast aperture, so this is the 56mm, sorry, 1.2. And that can be picked up for about $6.99 now. When you compare it to a zoom, which is a 2.8, and with that, that's around £850 still. So they're cheaper and sharper and lighter. So why would you really opt to go for a zoom? Well, the benefits of the primes can also be the cons of the primes. And what I mean by that is, so we spoke about the primes being smaller and lighter. However, to get the same focal range as you would with something like the 16-55 or even the 50-140, you're basically going to need about 3 or 4 lenses to match up to what a zoom is. So if you're to compare all these 3 lenses here, so we'd have a 23mm, a 56mm, and a 35mm for instance. So that's ranging from 23mm right up to 56. Well, that's a 16 all the way to 55, so why wouldn't you just get that? When you use a prime lens, or when you start to use a prime lens, it really helps your photography, especially if you're just starting out, because you have to work that much harder to be able to achieve what you're trying to achieve. The zoom lens, you can just zoom in and you can zoom out, and you can more or less get your frame in most of the time. However, with a prime lens, you can't do that. So you've either got to move closer to the subject or the thing you're trying to shoot. You've got to be a little bit more nimble on your feet, trying to get the framing correct. And that in itself can sometimes be challenging. However, it is a lot more fun, but you do have to work a little bit harder for it. On the upside of that, you can get faster lenses. So if you're trying to achieve sometimes more depth of field, if that's your thing, then obviously something like the 56mm 1.2 would give you a much better depth of field than what you would get with the 16-55 zoom which is basically a 2.8.
Other cons of the prime lenses are basically, sometimes because you can't get closer to your subject, you have no choice but to crop into your image so you can get your composition right. So by doing that, obviously you're losing pixels because you're cropping into your image, and you do lose a little bit of detail depending on how much you crop. However, you do get better at your framing when you use them more, so you don't have to quite crop into them as much, really. We also spoke about prime lenses being cheaper. So that is correct, prime lenses are cheaper. For instance, something like that, which is the 35mm f2, will set you around £360, £370. However, if you want to achieve the same as you would with one of the zooms, you'd have to buy 3 or 4 of the primes, and then it'll probably work out a little bit more expensive compared to the 16-55, for instance. Now there is another really good zoom which is classed as a kit lens, which is the 18-55, which actually has image stabilization built in as well. It's not quite as fast as the 16-55, which is a 2.8. It starts 2.8, and then when you zoom right in to 55, I believe it becomes a 4, so it's 2.8 to f4. But it's a great lens. That could be used as a travel lens. It starts wide, quite a fast lens, and then if you're out and about in sunny situations or bright situations like daytime, f4 really isn't an issue at all. Most time when I'm shooting primes, if I'm shooting on the street, I'm kind of shooting at f4 and above mostly, sometimes sort of like 5.6 or f8. So what are my preferences, primes or zooms? That's a really tricky answer. However, both. And it's not sitting on the fence, but it's the truth. It depends what you're shooting. So for me, if I'm doing street photography, the 23mm f2, which is currently on the X-T2 recording this right now, is always stuck to my X Pro 2. I prefer that focal length. I've always had 23mm for me, which gives you a 35mm on a full frame. Is just perfect. I just love the look it gives you. The slight distortion on the wide end if you get close. I just love it. It's fantastic. However, I also do like wider lenses. So I like things like the Samyang 12mm, and I like the way you can get real wide shots using that as well. And of course, I love depth of field. And in my opinion, you can only achieve really shallow depth of field if you go for something, but that is a really fast aperture in terms of like a 56mm, which is the 1.2. When you're doing events and stuff like that, you don't always have time to keep switching out between primes all the time. You definitely know the times when you need your primes, but then you know the times when you also need your zooms, and for that the 16-55 and the 50-140, that's the 50-140, they're your workhorses of your lenses, sorry, and I couldn't be without them. However, if I was travelling, I probably would take my primes. I would certainly take the 23mm, that's always stuck to my X Pro 2. I would take the 35mm f2. I would take the Samyang 12mm f2. I would probably take the 16-55 2.8, but I'm not sure if I would actually carry that around with me, because the 3 primes are predominantly what I would want to shoot, things like street photography and landscapes. What would you take? Would you take a single zoom or 2 zooms? Would you take just your primes, or would you take both? I'd love to hear your comments. I would love to see how different people shoot. Just remember, everyone is totally different. So what works for me might not work for you, and what works for you might not work for me. But that's cool. We can all have our own personal opinions and our own choices. Over the years, I've come to appreciate my kit being light. So I think that's why I probably would just carry 2 or 3 primes around with me. I still need to do my full art videos with the regards to discussing each lens, but I've been holding off a little bit with that, just simply because I've got some events coming up from next week onwards, and I wanted to give it a fair crack of the whip for each lens. I think it'd be unfair if I didn't do that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I will catch you guys real soon. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you later. Cheers. Bye.